Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Samach Zayin. This is the daf for Shabbat. We're going to get started from the bottom of Samach Vav Amud Bet at the word Shalach le Rav Nechemia Berei to Rav Yosef. So we have Rav Nechemia, the son of Rav Yosef, who sends halacha, like a psikat halacha, and we're going to see what this is, to Rabba Berei to Rav Huna Zute. To Rabba, the son of Rav Huna, the short one, okay, the small one, Linahardea. He sends this to Nahardea and he says the following. When the following woman gets to you and she wants to get from her father's inheritance money for her dowry, you can give her a tenth of the property of the father's estate, which is something that we learned way back when in Ketubot, that's part of what we give from the inheritance. The sons inherit, but the daughters get money for their dowry up to 1/10 of the father's property. But it's usually only counted from the property of the attached to the land, okay? Anything that's mechubar lakarka, land really, it's really land. From the land the father owns. So if the father doesn't own land, she doesn't really get anything. However, what he says is, even when this woman who's on her way to you apparently, or he knows she's going to come, when she gets there, give her a tenth from the estate of the father, even from the part of the millstone that's attached to the ground, because implements that are attached to the ground, and we're going to talk about this a lot today, are considered as if they're the ground themselves. And therefore, it's like karka, and therefore she can collect. Again, when you assess the value of the father's estate, and you come up with how much she should be getting, so count also the itzrubli of the rechaim, which is the part of the millstone that is attached to the ground, the bottom part. Amar Rav Ashi said, Ki avina be'Rav Kahana magvina nafilu me'amla debating. Okay, when I was in the house of Rav Kahana, we would collect even from the amla debate. The amla debate means the rent from the houses. If there were properties that they were collecting rent on, rent is considered like something attached to the ground. And also women who were collecting their dowry from the father's estate would be able to get from that as well. Okay, new mission. We're continuing on in, if you sell the following, what is included, what is not included. If you sell a courtyard, you get houses that are in that courtyard, not just the courtyard itself, but the courtyard includes the houses in the courtyard. It includes the ditches, the wells, the cisterns, the pits, right? All that stuff. But it does not include movable property. So if I was storing some movable property in the courtyard and I sold you the courtyard, that movable property wouldn't be yours. Only the things that, again, are attached to the ground. But if I said, I'm selling you the courtyard and everything in it, then even the movable property will be included. But whether I said this or whether I didn't say this, but if I sell you a courtyard, and even if I say everything in it, and there happens to be a bathhouse that I own, or an olive press, which is the lead into the next two Mishnayot. They're going to talk about what if I sold you an olive press and what if I sold you a Beit HaMerchatz, a bathhouse, what would be included? But these would not be included in the courtyard. Why is that? Because these don't only serve the people who are living in the courtyard, these serve the local people in different courtyards. So it's not really considered part of the courtyard. It happens to be situated there, but it's not considered part of the courtyard. So that definitely wouldn't be involved in the sale. That's all Tanakama. Comes Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer, if you sell a courtyard, you only sold the air of the courtyard, meaning just the courtyard space itself, the space, not anything in it, not the houses, not the ditches, any of that stuff, not the wells, the cisterns, all that are not included. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we're going to have a braita that gives us a little more detail about this, okay? Other things that are or not included. Tanu Rabbanan. So if you sell a courtyard, it includes any houses that are external, meaning they open up into the courtyard, and also batim pnimiyim, if you have inner houses that open up into the outer houses, which open up into the courtyard. Anything that even indirectly opens up into the courtyard is considered part of the sale. Beit hachutzaot are fields that they would mine for sand. There's a few different interpretations of this, but let's go with that basic interpretation. Today we're going to have a lot of that, where there's a lot of different interpretations. I'm recording this in advance, so I don't know, but I'm hoping that Shuli Mishkan will do a post on ancient olive presses, because that's going to be really important. There actually is one from Nazir, so you can look back. But I'm hoping that she'll get to do one also on the different parts of the olive press, because that's really what we're going to get to today. If not, you can research it yourself. So we have here Beit HaChulsaot. So we'll go with one of the interpretations that we're talking about a field that they would mine for sand. So if there's that inside the courtyard, that's also considered part of the courtyard. Chanuyot ptuchot letochanim karotima. If you have stores that are, by the way, we don't necessarily mean a field. There's usually aren't fields in a courtyard, but we mean land, right? There's some land and property that you can mine for sand. If there's stores, if they open up into the courtyard, then they're part of the courtyard. But if they open up into the public domain, then they're not considered part of the courtyard because they open up into the public. They happen to back into the courtyard, but because the door doesn't open into the courtyard, it's not considered part of the courtyard. What if they're ptuchot lekan or lekan? If they have a door in the courtyard and they also have a door into the main drag, so it really should be elunim kochotima. Basically, these stores are sold together with the courtyard because they have entrances also into the courtyard, and therefore they're included, although we'll see a bit of an issue with this in the Gemara as soon as we finish quoting this Braita. Again, this Braita quotes Rabbi Eliezer, who disagrees with Tanakama. Rabbi Eliezer only sold the air of the courtyard. Amar. Now we're going to go back to this line that I struggled with, or I mentioned the Gemara is going to struggle with. You'll see why in a minute. So if they're open to both sides, both the courtyard and into the public domain, it gets sold together with the chatzir. Right? If I said I'm selling you the courtyard, that includes this store. Rabbi Chia says if it's open in both directions, it's not sold. So we have a total contradiction, and that's really the Gemara's problem with this line. To which the Gemara answers, no, we have a simple answer. Lo kasha, this is not difficult. It really depends on what the purpose, the use of this item is, this store is. If the store is mostly used legav for the inner courtyard people, then it will be sold with the courtyard. But if most of the people who come into the store are coming from the main street, the Reshut Rabim, then it's not considered part of the courtyard, and then it wouldn't be part of the sale. So levar is outside, and then it wouldn't be part of the sale, and the gav is inside, and it would be part of the sale. Those are terms that we've seen a lot in the Gemara, so you should remember them, that bar is outside. You remember that because bar is usually wild, like chayot bar are wild animals. Wild are outside, and gav is the opposite, so it's inside. Right? Bar is just the one that's easier. By the way, the best way to remember this is a braita. What's a braita? It's outside, right? It's something brought in from the outside, meaning it wasn't in the Mishnah. Now we're going to this line about Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer, and what we really want to get to is the machlokah between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis, and in which case do they disagree? We're going to have two different versions of something Rava says. Our Gemara says Rabba with a hey, but the comments change it. It should be Rava with an aleph. And we're going to have two different versions of what Rava said, and which case they really are arguing about. Amar Rava, Ida Amar le dirta. Now, we're going to talk about words that are synonymous with chatzir. So we're going to differentiate in this first version between dirta and darta. Now, you might say that doesn't sound so different, and perhaps that's why there's a second version who thinks that dirta and darta are the same. But the first version is going to differentiate. Dirta, which sounds like dira, which is a place where one lives, apparently dirta was a word that was synonymous with courtyard. So if I said to you, I'm selling you a dirta, and I didn't say chatzir, I said dirta. Everybody agrees that includes the houses, because what I meant is a courtyard, and I used a particular synonym that implied it wasn't, right? It's not a perfect synonym. It's a synonym, as we know with synonyms. Each one sometimes has a bit of a different meaning, which means really living space. So therefore, I obviously meant the house. And even Rabbi Eliezer would agree. The machloket is if I said darta. And again, this first version thinks that there's a difference between dirta and darta, even though the root is the same, which means to live. But according to this version, darta doesn't mean that. Mar, or maybe doesn't. So mar savar tarbitza mashma. So Rabbi Eliezer thinks it sounds like tarbitza. Tarbitza is a courtyard. Courtyard only, not living space. And mar saval, but Tanakama holds bate mashma. But no, because it says darta and it has the root of living, that would also include houses. Some people say that that Rava said something different. I told you there's two versions. According to this, it doesn't matter dirta, darta. Everybody thinks that that includes houses. Even Rabbi Eliezer would agree the house would be included if you use that language. Ki pligi da amrle chatzir. The machloket is, as the simple reading of the Mishnah sounded, which is you said the word courtyard, chatzir. You said chatzir, you didn't use darta. Darta would be courtyard, which includes living spaces, and presumably dirta as well. But chatzir, mar savar chatzir avira mashma, mar savar ki chatzir mishkan. So again, Rabbi Eliezer is going to say courtyard. It sounds like the airspace of the courtyard, right? It's an open space. It's not talking about things that are built in the courtyard. Whereas Tanna Kama holds, it's like the courtyard of the Mishkan. In the Torah, it talks about the courtyard of the Mishkan. It talks about its size. And in the size, it includes also where the Ol Moed was and where the Kodesh Kodeshim was and all the, right, and everything. Then that was covered space that was more like living space. And it was included in what we call the courtyard of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle. So therefore, we're going to assume that if you use the word chatzer, just like when the Torah uses it, it includes the living space, likewise here as well. So that was two different versions of Rava about the debate between Tanna Kama and Rabbi Eliezer. Now we're going to have two different versions of Rava about something else that's connected to the Beit HaChulsaot that we mentioned, but really taking this a little bit off topic. Amar Rava, Amar Rav Nachman. So this time it's Rava quoting Rav Nachman. Machar lo chulsit u'metzula. If I sold you a space, land, that was good for mining for sand, by the way, they would use to make glass out of it, or a mitzula, and a mitzula, which is a place where they would mine for gold or silver. Now, if we did a sale, and I said I'm selling you both of these pieces of land, but remember, when you sell land, you have to do a kinyan. There has to be an acquiring. Until that point, anyone can change their mind. So what if you went down into the field and started doing mining for mining for sand in the sand field? That's what I just read before. If you did a chazaka on the land with the chulsit, with the sand, lo kana mitzula, you wouldn't acquire the piece of land that has the gold or the silver, because they're two different things. So acquiring one doesn't allow you to acquire the other. You might remember that we talked about a kinyan agav. Now, a kinyan agav is not this, it's similar, but that's why I want to mention it and point out the difference. Is a kinyan agav is when I'm buying land, or I'm selling you, let's say, land and movables, and you do an act of chazaka on the land. If we already talked in the sale about acquiring the land and the movables, you get the movables as well. This whole debate, does it mean movables only that are in that land, or it could be even if it's not in the land, but that's not the issue right now. But that's called the kinyan agav, that if I do a chazaka on a kinyan, then I can acquire on the land, particularly, I can acquire the metaltalin through that. This is land and land. And basically we say, you did a chazaka on one, it doesn't include the other, even though the sale itself was talking about both. And likewise, and the reverse. Okay, if it was the land with the gold or silver, you wouldn't be able to acquire the chulsit with that. To which the Gemara asks, Ini, is this really true? Didn't Shmuel say, Macharlo eser sadot be'eser medinot? This we saw also. Shmuel says, if I sold you 10 pieces of land in 10 different countries, since you acquire one, you acquire them all. Because if you remember, we view all of land as one big giant piece of land, because it's all on planet Earth, you could say. So why wouldn't that work with this field or land that has chulsit, has sand in it, and the field that has gold and silver? So the answer, why are these different? It's not the same, because hatamhu desadna da'arachatu. There we view the whole world as one big piece of land. And that's because all the land is used for one purpose, right? You plant on it. But here we have two different pieces of land that are used for two totally different purposes, one to mine for sand and one to mine for gold or silver. That's not the same thing at all. And therefore, acquiring one doesn't help you acquire the other. That's the version number one. So version number one is one doesn't acquire the other. And if you ask, what about this land? Oh, it's not the same as land because the uses are different. But the second version is to say something very different. And with that, we'll move to Amud Bet. Some people say, Amar Rav Nachman, and the Hagahot Bach adds, and the reverse. Okay, so if you acquire one, you acquire the other, the sand field or gold or silver. Deha Amar Shmuel, sorry, I skipped a word. To which the Gemara asks, Pshita, isn't this obvious? Why is it so obvious? Because Amar Shmuel, because of what Shmuel said. Shmuel says, just like if you acquire 10 fields, if you sell 10 fields and the person doesn't act of chazaka on one, all of them are acquired. Wouldn't you say it's the exact same thing here? So isn't it obvious? Why did Rava need to say it if Shmuel already said it before him? To which we answer what we said before, which is Mao Ditema, you might have thought, but here it's the opposite conclusion of the previous. You might have thought Hatam hu desadna de'arachadu. You might have thought there it's different because we can view it all as one because it all has the same use. Aval hacha tashmish l'chud v'tashmish l'chud. Here you might have thought that acquiring one wouldn't help you to acquire the other because each one has a different use. Kamashmalan, that's why Rava needed to teach you, or Rav Nachman really, Rava was quoting him, that acquiring one actually gets you both, okay? And that's the opposite conclusion of the first reading of Rava, but the in-between is kind of the same idea, that do we distinguish between these two for this reason, or do we not distinguish? Okay, but the same reason to potentially distinguish is brought up in both. Again, this is two versions of what the same person said, so, and how the back and forth went when he said it. Now we're going to do a new Mishnah. Okay, so let's just review this part. We started with the woman and getting her dowry, and that we can collect it not just from the item, not just from land, but also from items that are attached to the ground, and also rent from houses that are attached to the ground. Then we went to when you acquire a chatzer, what is included? We saw machloket Tanakama and Rabbi Eliezer. We had a machloket in the Gemara. What language do they have a machloket about? Okay, which any chatzer, or maybe just if you use the word darta, or maybe if you use the word chatzer. Okay, but darta would be clear that everyone would agree, or maybe only dirta would be clear that everyone would agree. And then we talked about which parts are included in the selling of the chatzer and which aren't. And then we talked about this last point about the chulsit and the mitzula, and acquiring one, can you acquire the other? Two different versions of Rava, whether you could or not. Now we're moving on to the olive press. And as I mentioned before, and part of what makes this sugya complicated is not really the Gemara part itself, but how to define the different parts of the olive press. And the reason, what I mentioned before, is that there were many different styles of pressing olives. And as a result, there were different implements that used. Now, when people, the Mishnah was obviously referring to a particular type, and everybody knew what they were referring to and what all the parts were. By the time you get to the Gemara, they might have had different olive presses, and they didn't have the same parts as those olive presses. So, like I said, perhaps Shuli will write an article about it. So I'm recording this in advance. Or perhaps you can, if she doesn't, you can look up on Google and find ancient olive presses and try to make sense out of what these parts might be. I warn you that it's quite complicated to figure out what all these parts are, but it will be interesting to just see how they made olive oil in the ancient world. So what's confusing is the people in the Gemara weren't living in the same time as the Mishnah, nor in the same location, and therefore had different ways of making olive oil, and therefore read it perhaps differently than the Mishnah was meant. Then you jump to the Rishonim, who also had different implements and didn't know how to understand the Gemara and what terms they used. So we're not going to have a great amount of clarity here. I'll try to give you one interpretation, perhaps maybe more than one in some of the places. So not to confuse you too much, but to let you have an understanding here that it's a bit unclear. And we're going to see, I'll tell you already right away when we get to the Mishnah, which is what's included and what's not included in olive press, also what defines each category, even if we don't necessarily know what all the implements are. The question is which is also affected by what the definition of these implements are, is really what is the criteria that determines whether or not it would be included in the sale of the olive press or not. So we'll talk about that in just one moment. I'm not going to even try to define these terms yet, but these are the three things that are included in the sale. Okay, the only word I can really explain to you very clearly is the korah. The korah is the beam. That's really the main part of the olive press, which is a little strange that Tanakama doesn't think it's included, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But it's a beam that's used that presses down on the olives. Okay, what you basically do is you put the olives in a vat. This is just a basic way without getting into the different methods, but you put them in a big vat, and then after crushing them, okay, you crush them with something to kind of break them, and then it's easier to get the oil out of them. Then you put, okay, we're going to see, you put some beams across, okay, some boards, I would say, not even beams, wooden boards to kind of both. We're going to see there were boards they used, perhaps, again, depending on interpretation you go, to hold them in place so the olives didn't go out. And also there were boards that would help, that when you put the big beam on top, now the big beam is just one beam, but this is big circular thing, and the beam doesn't get to all the places in the olive press. So when you put that big beam down, which by the way, some had pulley systems and all that, which could be connected to the galgal, which is like a wheel, a pulley system, perhaps. But what happens is when you put the beam down, you want the olives to all get affected by the beam. So they would put different boards underneath so that the beam would go on the boards and the boards would press on the olives. Okay, that's the basic way of getting the olives out. So this is basically distinguishing between the yam, the mamal, the betula, which we don't know what they are, and the avivim, and the galgal and the korah. Now, those are not included in the cell. The first category are. So the Rashbam says, again, without getting into what all these things are, and this also causes complications, the Rashbam says the first three are attached to the ground, and the second three are not attached to the ground, and that explains it. Okay? Anything attached to the ground is part of the olive press. Anything not attached to the ground is not. Now, Rabbeinu Tam in the Tosfot, and the Ramah with a hey, not the Ramah with an aleph who comments on the Shulchan Aruch, but the Ramah with a hey, so Sephardi commentary, Rishon, says that they say that we're talking about here items that if I were to sell an olive press, let's just go into my head. I want to sell you an olive press. I'm going to sell you any parts of it. I'm going to include anything that I have no independent use for. And that's, by the way, would explain well why the korah. The korah, according to the Rashbam, is not included because it's movable, even though it's a key part of the olive press. According to Rabbeinu Tam and the Ramah, it's not included because I have many other uses for a beam, not just for an olive press. So I'll keep it for myself to use for something else. But if it's something that is only usable in the olive press, then why on earth would I keep it for myself? The Ramah even adds something different, which is not the perspective of the seller, but from the perspective of the buyer. When the buyer buys something, let's say you buy an olive press, if there's parts that are very hard to get and borrow from somebody else, then you're going to want it included in the sale. And therefore, if it's a part that you can't really get easily by itself, then obviously you intended to buy it when you bought it, and therefore I intended to give it to you as well. So those are all possibilities as to understanding why these would be included or not included. So either attached to the ground, not attached to the ground, that's the Rashbam, or assume, right, reasonable to assume I would include it in the sale because either I have no use for it otherwise, or, right, and if I did, then I won't include it in the sale, or you have no other way of getting it, so why would you buy an olive press if it wouldn't include that part? Because how else are you going to get it? Or it's hard to get. So again, what these things are, we'll see in the Gemara, and then again, we'll have to see how we interpret what the Gemara says. Ubizman she'amarlo, back to the Mishnah, if you said, hu v'chol ma shebetocho, just like in the previous Mishnah, and we'll see this in the next Mishnah as well, I'm selling you this olive press and everything in it, then harei kulam mechurim, then obviously I'm including everything. Rabbi Eliezer omer, hamochel beit habad machal et hakorah. Rabbi Eliezer in this case actually includes more. He says, what are you talking about? If I sell a beit habad, of course it includes the beam. And we're going to see this later in a Braita. They're going to explain, or in the Gemara later, sorry, they're going to explain, because that's the main part of the olive press. So why would I sell you one without the beam? So we disagree with Tanakama on the beam. Now the Gemara starts and says, Yam tzlafchata. Tzlafchata, okay, tzlafot are, talfachot are lentils. So everyone agrees, however you interpret this, it's something round. The question is what? So we'll go with the Rashbam, who says basically this is, or at least one of his interpretations, this is the big, the container or a barrel that they would put all the olives in. I don't know what you call it exactly, not a barrel, but container they would put all the olives in when they would go to press them. So it's a big round thing that's attached to the ground that fits perfectly with the Rashbam, that it's attached to the ground. That's why it's included. Mamal, Amar Rabbi Abba bar Mamal, mafrachta. Okay, first of all, notice that Rabbi Abba, the son of Mamal, is translating Mamal. Often rabbis are actually called names based on opinions of theirs about something. So maybe that's why he got this name, unclear, or maybe it really is his father's name. Maybe that's why he knew what it was, because, you know, often when you have a name, you know what it means. Like I happen to know Farber is painter in French because that's my name. You might not know that. So anyway, it's just interesting to point out. I don't have anything major to say about it, but how does he define mamal? Mafrachta. Now, lafrich is to break. So again, it's something, we don't know how, that's involved in breaking it in the process. Either it's some stone, you have to say according to the Rashbam, why would it be attached? It's not attached to the ground. Some people think it's in the container. There was then a smaller thing made of stone where the olives would actually sit, where they would be crushed, and that would be then attached to the ground. So it's something that was used in the breaking of the olives, which is again the first stage after you collect them. Bitulot. Rabbi Yochanan, klunsot shel erez shemamidim behem et hakoha. These are beams of cedar that they would, or planks of cedar that would either these posts that would support the beam of the olive press. Okay, if you look at pictures, you could see there's these like 3 beams that go around, and that holds the beam into place, like it's hanging from there. Perhaps it's that, because that's also stationary and attached to the ground. Could be something else. We'll go with that for right now. Avirim. Okay, those are the first 3, by the way, that are considered part of the sale. Now we're going to get to the 3 that are not. Avirim, kivshe. Okay, that doesn't really help us. Commentaries explain what is kivshe. Kivshe are the wooden boards that they would put on top. They're more movable, and the beam would go on top of that. And that would, again, like we said, evenly distribute how the olives get crushed. So it's not just the ones under the beam, but obviously all of them. Next one, galgal, humarta. Okay, this doesn't really help us either. So again, we'll go with galgal. It's something, again, rounded. Some people think it's a rounded stone that they would put on the beam. They would put these weights down on the beam to pull the beam down, so it would crush the olives better. Perhaps it's that. Perhaps it's the pulley system that they would use. Okay, this is not included in the sale. And the korah, okay, that's obvious. That's the beam. We don't need an explanation of that. Tanu Rabbanan. Hamocher, now we're going to bring a braita that's similar, but perhaps a little different without getting into major differences. Again, it's hard to know because we don't really know how to define them. The Gemara doesn't really point out that there are differences, but the Gemara just quotes it. Hamocher beit haba macharet nisarim. Now, included in this is the sale of the wooden board. Now, this is strange because what wooden boards? We just said the wooden boards aren't included. They're much more, right? They move, they have other uses. So some people say these are different wooden boards. They were boards used, as I said before, to make sure the olives don't fall out, and they're actually more stationary in there. They're permanent, perhaps. Okay, unclear exactly. Et yikavim. Okay, the yikavim, the Rashbam explains, find it for a second. The yikavim are the, right, yamachakuka suyake ein yekev. Okay, this is probably more like the yam that we said before. It's the big basin or basket in which they would put all the olives, or container. And the next one is the mafrechot, which is the second thing we had, the mama, which breaks, again, causes the breaking. Could be, again, the base in which they're broken, the top part of the mortar, or the pestle part. Okay, there's a debate about which one. But these 2 at least match the previous Mishnah, our Mishnah. Ve'et harechaim hatachtoniot. And the bottom part of the mortar, okay, this is the mortar, not the pestle part. Okay, so maybe the mafrechot is the upper part. Also the rechaim hatachtoniot, or maybe the mafrechot is something else. Again, it's not exactly clear. Avalot elyona. So here they specifically say it's not the upper part of the millstone. So again, you'd have to say the stone. If you say it's a stone above the mafrechot, it's something else. It's not exactly part of the millstone. Like I said, a lot of lack of clarity what all these parts are. But again, this braita says, just like the Mishnah, if you said this includes everything, then obviously it would include everything. But either which way, this definitely doesn't include the other wooden boards that we were talking about. That makes it clear that the nisarim there are not the avirim that we were talking about before. They're not the same wooden boards. You know, what the difference is, it's not so super clear, but clearly lo macharet avirim, and that's why this braita doesn't really contradict our Mishnah. Not the bags, okay, that were made out of goat hairs, or not the bags that were made out of leather that they would use probably for carrying the olives to the olive press. That for sure is not included in the sale. That makes a lot of sense. Rabbi Eliezer, again, Rabbi Eliezer appears in this braita just like he appears in our Mishnah. Okay, I assume this is, again, this could be a quote from the Gemara, or it could be just a continuation of the braita, which is that the Beit Habad, so Rabbi Eliezer says, right, it doesn't include it does include the korah, because the whole point of a Beit Habad is the korah. That's the main implement. Of course, that's included. New Mishnah. Hamocher et hamerchatz, or Beit hamerchatz. Lo machar et hanisarim ve'et haspalim ve'et habalaniyot. Balaniyot, usually think of the women who work in the mikveh. That's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about selling people. You don't get the wooden boards. Wooden boards they would use presumably to cover the floor because they would heat the floors. That was how they heated the room. The floors were very hot then. So they needed to put boards on top so that people could walk on them and also not get their feet dirty and also not get burnt. Etasfalim, these were basins in which they would use for washing. And the balaniyot, which is probably towels. Although there are different interpretations what this is. So these are all, again, very movable and usable in other areas, not just in the bathhouse. Bizman she'amar lo hiva chomasha b'tocha, again, the Mishnah says, just like all the other ones, if you said, I'm selling you the bathhouse and everything in it, harei kulam b'chulim, right? This is very much like you sell a house. Right? And then you'd say, I'm selling all the furniture, I'm selling everything in it, right? And then you could see you getting into an argument. What about the garbage cans? What do you mean? You took the garbage cans out. Why take the garbage cans? And you say everything, right? Well, what does everything mean? So here they say it really means everything. Benkach ubenkach, but whether you said I'm selling you everything or didn't say that, lo machar lo et hamegurot shamayim v'lo et otzarot shel ha'etzim. But there were these pools of water that they would use for the water for the bathhouse, but they also used for so many other things, for water, for drinking water, all that, and also not otzarot shel ha'etzim, and they would have these storehouses for wood. It wouldn't be included because the wood could be used for lots of other things, right? People used it for heating, not just for the bathhouse. So all those things are not included in the sale of the bathhouse, even if you said everything included. Tanu Rabbanan, here we're going to see a Braita, and we'll stop kind of in the middle of this Braita, as our Daf does. Hamocheret hamerchatz machar et beit hanesarim ve'et beit hayikamim ve'et beit hasfalim ve'et beit havilaot. By the way, balaniot, some people have the word vilaot, which are curtains possibly. Okay, and then it means curtains that they would use for privacy in the bathhouse. And then, what are we talking about here? Beit hanesarim is a house where they would keep all the wood for the bathhouse, or beit yikamim, where they would keep all the yikamim. Now, what yikamim is? So there's a big debate about this. The Rashbam says, if we look in the Rashbam, beit hanesarim. Sorry, I'm looking for it. Sfalim, vilaot. No, it's further down. Okay, beit ha. Okay, beta. Sorry, beta nesarim et beta yikavim. גרסינו בתוספתא יש מפרשים חדר שמצניעים בו הגיגיות שמשימים בו מים. מים חמים, sorry. Okay, so some people say there are these basins. It was a place where they would keep all these basins where they would fill up the water. Okay, unclear. Some people, there's a big debate about what exactly this means. I'm going to leave it at the Rashbam. But basically what we're saying is, okay, I'll read the next line of so basically, if I sell a bathhouse, it's going to include all these houses that are secondary to it. The place where they would store all the wood for it, the place where they would store all the water basins for it, the place where they would store the curtains, okay, the place where they would store all these implements that were useful for the bathhouse, but it's not including all the objects, all the movable objects in them. And that fits with the Rashbam before, who said movables, yes, non-movables, not. Right? I'm sorry. Non-movables, yes. Movables wouldn't be part of the sale. Ubizman she'amar lo, again, you're ready for this line. We've been seeing it over and over again. Zman she'amar lo hiva chomash b'tocham, selling you the bein hamerchatz and everything that goes along with it. Harei kulam chulim, then everything's included. But benkach ubenkach, but whether I said it or whether I didn't say it, lo machar lo et habrechot, and we'll kind of end mid-sentence, but we'll finish up this first part of the sentence. Na brechot ha-mesapkot lo mayim bein b'yimot hachama o b'yimot hagshami. Doesn't include water that was collected, these pools of water from which they would get it, whether it's the winter or the summer. Why do I say whether the winter or the summer? So the Rashbam says, well, even in the summer when there's very little water in them because it's a dry season, you might think, oh, maybe that's just considered secondary to the bathhouse because it's not even significant in and of itself. But no, these pools, since they are used for other things, they're not included in the sale of the bathhouse. Okay, so already with that, we'll stop for today. We're in the middle of this Braita. We'll finish it up in tomorrow's Daf. Just to review, we saw the first part we already discussed about mainly the selling of the courtyard, and then we got to the selling of the olive press and the selling of a bathhouse. And from this, we learned a lot about things that go on in the olive press and in the bathhouse and how they would work and what parts are included in the sale, what parts are not included in the sale. And perhaps it depends on also what I said when I was selling you the item, the house. Okay. And with that, we'll finish today's Daf. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom or Shavua Tov.